Okay, so a warm welcome to everyone to our second webinar today on maritime trends to watch in 2022. This is our second session with a focus on cargo. Just to advise you that this session is being recorded and you can download this afterwards for replay on our website. Moving on to the agenda slide. So first of all, a few words on who is on the panel. So I am Ulrich Kadow. I'm the Global Head of Marine at Allianz Global Corporate and Specialty. And on the line with me today, we have two colleagues from our Allianz Risk Consulting team, Captain Rahul Khanna and Captain Andrew Kinsey. Both of them will speak in depth about some of the findings from our safety and shipping report. And we also have on the phone two colleagues from our North American team, Rich Soja, who is the global head for our inland marine line of business and also the region head for marine in North America, and Ryan O'Connor, who is the region head for our cargo line of business in North America. Our agenda today will cover details of our latest shipping loss data and the safety and shipping report. Then we will go into three topics in a bit more depth, one being COVID-19, then also larger vessels and what this means for exposure and underwriting, and lastly, climate change. Following that, both Rich and Ryan will cover the insurance market outlook with a few talking points, and then we'll have hopefully a good amount of time for live Q&A where you can submit questions already as we go through the various slides and our presentation, but then of course also towards the end of the session in the Q&A section. So for that, you should be able to find on the bottom right of your screen a Q&A section where you can just type in and enter your question, as I said, as we go along once we enter the Q&A section. So the Allianz Safety and Shipping Review, that's one of the reports that we publish every year. This year was almost the 10th time that we did it. We started publishing this report since 2012, and it's one of our market leading publications, including analytics around total losses and incidents that happened over the recent past in the shipping industry. And then we enhance that with some of our expert knowledge to make sense of the data and identify some of the key industry trends and insights that we do want to share with our brokers and clients, as well as identify a number of emerging risks. You can download this report on our website. The link is shown here on the slide at any time, and I would encourage you, if you haven't done so yet, to do so and read through it. And with that said, I would already jump into the first agenda item, which is the shipping losses data. And Captain Rahul Khanna from our Allianz Risk Consulting team will lead through this. And with this, over to you, Rahul.
Thank you, Ulrich, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone, wherever you are. Firstly, let me just quickly explain what sort of data do we look at. I think it's important to understand that before we go into details of some of the statistics and analytics that we produce. We look at the total loss data from a calendar year, the previous calendar year. In this case, it will be the calendar year 2020 from January to December. And we look at all the total losses that have happened in the shipping industry. And we will be doing some sort of analysis on that, slicing and dicing the data, trying to give you some insights on that. We also look at the incidents that happened over the last year in the shipping industry, and these are generally including the total losses that we talk about. So let's dive into the details. First, this is the first slide, which will give you a bit of an overview of what we saw in 2021. As you can see, there were 49 total losses in 2020, and this number 49 is 50% decline over the last decade. In the earlier part of the decade, we were consistently having 100 or thereabout total losses in the industry, and I think over the years, the shipping industry can almost put a pat on his back, saying that we have managed to reduce total losses by 50% over the last decade. This is no mean achievement, and I think there's a lot of work which has been put in collectively by the industry, whether it's the regulators, the ship owners, the classification societies, that include ourselves, insurers as well, because we play an equal part. And the record and the trend is really positive going on year on year. Out of the 49 vessels that were lost, 18 were cargo ships that were lost, which is almost 37% of all the vessels lost. And this is the trend that we've seen for the last few years. We had a total of 2,703 shipping incidents in 2020, and this is a 4% reduction from 2019 data. We'll speak a little bit more about these numbers later on. That there are certain other analysis and numbers that we calculate within the report. For example, we look at the piracy area, like some interesting statistics here, as the 95% of crew kidnapped reported at sea in 2020 came out of Gulf of Guinea, which is fast becoming the hotspot for piracy. I won't go into too much detail on this in the further sections, but similar type of reports and statistics are available in the report if you wish to download. Go on next slide, please. This is where you see the trend over the past decade of the total losses. As you can see, from 128, high of 128 losses in 2012, we are now down to 49. There's a bit of a plateau from 2018 onwards where we are hovering around the 50 total loss mark, which may mean that we might have reached some sort of a level or a sustainable level. But any single loss, any single total loss is a bit too much. So we as an industry have to focus on even reducing these numbers going forward. It becomes obviously a lot harder because there will be some incidences, there will be some losses. That's why the insurance industry is there for. But hopefully we can continue this excellent trend going over the years. If we now look at the losses from which region they have come across, this is the first analysis that we do. On the left-hand side, you'll see the 49 total losses divided by the region, and on the right is the 10-year overview of the similar statistic. South China Sea, Indochina, Indonesia, and Philippines has been the area where we've seen maximum number of total losses coming from, and this wasn't any exception in 2020 as well, where we saw 16 total losses out of the total 49 that came from this area, followed by 7 total losses in East Mediterranean Black Sea, which is number 2, and similarly some of the other regions. But if you look at the right side, the picture pretty much remains the same. So South China and Indochina, Indonesia, and Philippines, that region tops the chart and has been topping the chart with 224 total losses out of the 876 total losses that we saw in the last 10 years. Followed by East Mediterranean Black Sea with 126 losses, Japan, Korea, North China with 87 losses, and then British Isles, North Sea, English Channel, and the Bay of Biscay with 62 losses, followed by some of the other regions. Now, there are plenty of reasons why these are happening, but it's very difficult to go into details of all of them in this short amount of time. But we have made some commentary on what we think are the reasons for this. If we now look at total losses in a slightly different way, next slide, please. On this slide, we actually look at what types of vessels have been involved in these 49 total losses. And as I was saying earlier, cargo vessels were the top category, which were lost last year, and 18 of them were lost in 2020, followed by 10 fishing vessels, 5 passengers, 3 tugs, and 2 bulk carriers. Cargo vessels have, since the last 10 years, been on the top always, and this has been a feature and something that we have been making a bit of a commentary about, that there are many reasons why cargo vessels feature in the top. But again, this is something that as an industry we need to work on and try and see if we can lift some of the standards, some of the issues that come across because of these losses. If you look at next slide, please. On this one, we are looking at total losses by the cause. The top cause for losses has been foundering, which essentially means sinking of the vessel or foundering. 24 of the 49 vessels were lost because of foundering, followed by 10 fire and explosion as the cause. And then there were 7 vessels which were wrecked and stranded, and followed by 2 collisions. It's notable to mention that four of these 49 total losses came from a single event, which was the Beirut port explosion in 2020, with a massive explosion, which some of you might remember happened, and that was a loss. That was a single incident responsible for 4 of these losses. And there have been some of the other notable losses, like the Wakashio in Malaysia, and also the Stella Banner in Brazil, which went aground and was scuttled because it was deemed a constructive total loss. Next slide, please. And as I said earlier, we also look at all casualties and incidents that we see in the shipping industry. This is a collection of all the incidents which might be, could be collisions, could be groundings, could be fires, could be smaller collisions with ports, smaller collisions with other crops, which may or may not result in a total loss. But these numbers include the 49 total losses that we have mentioned. I should also mention that all this data is for vessels over 100 gross tons only. We don't consider vessels below that, so there will be a large number of smaller crafts which are excluded from this report. But if we compare the data of total incidents, which also gives us a bit of an insight, and we like to see where these incidents are coming from. And British Isles, North Sea, English Channel, and Bay of Biscay has again consistently been one of the reasons in the top 3 for the last 10 years. The left chart shows you the data for 2020, and the right chart gives you the data for the last 10 years. And for the last 10 years, East Mediterranean and Black Sea accounts for as much as 4,500 incidences, followed by British Isles, North Sea, in English Channel with 4,300, and then South China, Indochina, Indonesia, and Philippines. In some of the previous presentations, people have asked me that why South China, Indochina is the region with maximum number of total losses, but is 50% less when it comes to incidences. The answer to that is a difficult one to answer, but I would assume that there is a large inconsistency on how regions and countries report the loss data or incidents. It may be that the British Isles and the East Mediterranean region report many incidences and many even some minor ones, and it may be that some of the other regions which are lower down the list do not report enough instances. But nevertheless, that is something that we do not control, but the data that comes across still tells us that here are certain regions where we need to be a little more careful if we are operating our vessels in these regions. Next slide, please. As Ulrich mentioned in the agenda, we are focusing on 3 different aspects from a risk trends perspective and what has impacted the shipping industry in the last year, and also what we think are important ones which might affect going forward. The first one, COVID-19. I think all of us have seen our lives being affected and impacted by COVID-19 throughout last year and this year as well, and in some cases lives have completely changed, and shipping industry has been no different. We've had some major impacts on the shipping industry because of COVID-19. If you look at the next slide, I think none so more important and more devastating as the impact on crew change and the crew change and humanitarian crisis that has been developing since the COVID-19 started. The problem came from the closure of borders. The problem came from the inability for vessel owners to send the crews back after their normal times on board, and usually crew would spend anything from a few months to 6 to 8 months on board the vessel. But once their term on board the vessel is finished, they are generally replaced by other crew members, and this wasn't possible because of COVID-19. And the crisis became so severe and so intense that some of the crew members have not been home for more than a year and stuck on board ships. And we can see that in that time, during the COVID-19 crisis, if you as a seafarer which are serving on board ship, which in any case is a difficult life to lead, is full of risks, and you are unable to go home and you're worried about your families, this puts the seafarers into an extreme mental stress and in a condition which they should not have been subject to do anyway. So this crisis really is still ongoing. At one given time, I think we had more than 200,000 seafarers stuck on board vessels who have crossed their there are normal contract periods on board the vessels. And as we know that 75% of incidents and probably even more casualties are related to human error. And a mentally stressed and mentally fatigued seafarer on board is not something that we would want, and it's not going to help. So as an industry, we should be addressing this as soon as possible. On that note, I think there's quite a lot of work which has been done already. We have the Neptune Declaration, which was done, and more than 700 companies and organizations signed up to that, and they have essentially said and laid out some of the measures that we should take as an industry and as governments to resolve this crisis. One of them being providing the essential worker status to our seafarers so that the crew change is made possible. Some of the countries have already done that, but quite a few still haven't. And the problem remains that a lot of ports are still not allowing crew members to go back home after they completed the contract, and in some cases even when they're sick. And I think in one odd cases where a horror story typically emerged, where a crew member died and unfortunately his body wasn't being able to repatriate back to his home for a few months. So this crisis can have multiple impacts, and it can have a direct impact on shipping safety as well. So as an industry, we should be working relentlessly to solve this problem. One of the other impacts of COVID-19 has been the delay in supply chain, and we find ourselves in a time where we've never seen such chaos, which has now engulfed the supply chain industry at the moment. We are looking at displaced containers. We are looking at shortage of containers themselves. If they are available, they are in the wrong place. It might take months for them to come back to their manufacturing hubs in the east. This is primarily due to what happened in the initial months of COVID, when the manufacturing hubs closed down and demand collapsed quite quickly. But then in the middle of last year, surprisingly to some, the demand actually shot up quite substantially, which meant that the containers were not in the right places. They were not available for loading, and at the moment we are looking at severe delays on goods being transported across the world. As an example, if some of you are following the freight markets, a 7,000 TEU container vessel today would be roughly anything between $150,000 to $200,000 a day. The charter rates for these. These are numbers which we probably never heard for container vessels ever before, and that tells you the situation, how dire it is. You can probably see around you in the supermarket and the shelves where some of them seem to be empty because the goods haven't been able to make way to these places, because there is simply no more space on board container vessels and container slots available. A lot of smaller shippers, a lot of smaller consignees and businesses have really found it very difficult now to obtain a container slot and to ship their goods. And the cost itself of shipping a container, for example, from China to the western coast of the United States, has gone as much as 5 to 6 times what it used to be pre-pandemic. And a lot of smaller companies have never factored that sort of increased cost into their numbers. As of June 21, I think there was a record 300 vessels waiting outside ports to enter, and that has been one of the main reasons why crisis has been brewing, and the supply chains have been really hampered. Just a quick comment on the cruise vessels. I think this was one of the sectors in the shipping industry which was very severely impacted. Most of them, or pretty much all of them, were laid up after the crisis happened or started back in March 2020, and a lot of them are still laid up because the market really hasn't picked up. Even after all the vaccination numbers that we have seen in certain countries, a lot of vaccination numbers are not as good in some of the countries where these vessels operate. Hence, they are still laid up, and because of fears of safety concerns of the crew as well as the passengers. Next slide, please. One of the other very important aspects that and an issue that we have raised repeatedly in the last few years has been the larger vessels and the disproportionate risk that these vessels present to the industry. Now, over the last so many years, shipping industry has worked on economies of scale. That has been one of the principles which dictated the size of the vessels for many years, and that has meant the vessel size has grown up immensely. On the next slide, you will see how container vessels evolution has happened over the last 50 years. 1968, when the first container vessel came into being, it was a massive 1,530 TEUs, as I recall reading some of the reports from those. But compare that to what we have today is more than 24,000 TEU vessels. The HMM AGCS is probably one, and I think there are even larger vessels on order at this given time. The container vessel capacity has increased, the size has increased by 1,500% since the time they came into being, and has doubled over the last 15 years. And the problem that we see here is that it's all well and good to have the economies of scale, yes, and there are some definite benefits for these larger vessels, but the risk posed by these vessels, especially when they are involved in a casualty or in an incident, the cost can suddenly spiral up. The complexity of managing the casualties and even the expertise required to manage these casualties on these mega ships is something that the industry still needs. We'll look at the next slide, please. So one of the key issues that we've seen on the larger vessels has been fire. I think 2019 saw one of the largest numbers of fires on these mega vessels. It was something like a fire every 10 days, and 2020 hasn't really cooled off any bit, because 2020 saw, I think, one fire every 2 weeks on board these vessels. And these numbers are staggering in the sense that we have always had fire as a key peril, but focusing on mega vessels and big vessels, fire is becoming such a big problem, because the methods, the ways in which we could or traditionally dealt with fire on board vessels are probably no longer applicable on these behemoths. We are talking about 24,000 containers on board these ships, 10, 15 tier high, just to reach and find the cause of fire and try and attack at the base of the fire is proving to be very, very, very difficult. Even though so that the crew members have lost their lives trying to fight these fires. And the cost associated with some of these, and you might remember some of the big names that have happened in the last few years, the Maersk, the Antian Express, and some of the others, have ended up costing hundreds of millions of dollars in claims in these vessels. So this is one of the key concerns that we have in this section. And we obviously have the other big concern of container losses, but I'll hand that over to Andrew for you to explain in a lot more detail. So Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rahul. As Rahul stated, this is another one of our larger vessels and larger exposures, is the incident and number of container losses that we saw. We saw a large spike in the losses at sea, and it's driven by a combination of factors. Vessel size, the length, as well as the beam, and the incidence of parametric rolling on some of these vessels. Also, the very high stowage levels that they have reached, the capacity filling the boxes up has a direct impact on the structural integrity of the container stack itself, combined with severe weather, as we've seen in our environmental models, which we'll also touch on later. More and greater severity in storms, larger amounts, greater severity, has led to increased stresses on the total supply chain, and container carriage is part of that. So when we combine all of these issues, we have seen an increase in the amount of container losses. A lot of this has been focused in the North Pacific on key trade routes. Further studies by IAX and the classes is definitely required on this, so we can fully understand and evaluate how to prevent these losses in the future. Another issue which we wanted to touch on briefly was the actual twilight of the VLOCs. The last of these vessels are being scrapped, and this is actually one of the last chapters of Open 90, because these VLOCs were actually converted VLCCs. These are the last of the single skin tankers that were phased out of Open 90 and converted to bulk carriers, and these are now being scrapped. Next slide, please. We'll now touch briefly on climate change and some of the issues which are impacting our supply chain and our carriage of goods. Next slide. On the environmental pressures, it's an overall pressure on the shipping industry. to cut global emissions. Now, the international shipping industry produced just over 1 billion tons of greenhouse gases in 2018. That was almost 10% increase over 2012. So we continue to see pressures to cut this greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the IMO 2020 low sulfur transition was successful, more so than many people had prognosticated, but it was not without its challenges, and it was also associated with increased claims activity. The issues were included bunkering issues as well as scrubber failures, and insurers have seen a number of machinery claims related to this. Now, finally, with Arctic shipping activity grew 25% over the last 6 years, and this growth will continue and most likely increase. This is due to a number of factors, but the bottom line is it's a shorter route, and as it becomes more utilized, it will become successful and it will attract more and more varied cargoes. However, sailing in Arctic waters presents a number of risks to the vessel, the crew, as well as the cargo that need to be evaluated beforehand and planned around. It's not just a matter of departing the vessel at the sea buoy and then going north instead of south. It has to be planned, and it has to be understood the risks that are associated with this route. It is a remarkable achievement that we are looking at a new shipping route. We always say, we're sailing the same waters that Magellan did. So when we start to see the opening of a new route, it is both a fascinating and then also a fraught endeavor. One of the keys to this is that you have to prepare the crew as well as the vessel. There is no infrastructure in this route. As a result, we have to be able to support the vessel internally, not just externally. In the event of an accident or an incident, the cost of response will be significantly greater on an Arctic route than it will be on non-Arctic waters. In the event of a serious marine incident and any pollution, those costs will be astronomical. So as we look at the overall integrity of the supply chain, it's critical that we don't just look at the total distance and the potential cost savings in a fuel burn, but we fully understand the risks associated and that we plan accordingly. Thank you. Next slide. For the insurance market outlook, I will pass it over to Ryan.
Thank you, Captain Kinsey. I think I'll just start this off. Hello, everyone. Ryan O'Connor and I will spend just a few minutes commenting on the ocean cargo market outlook in North America. Specifically, Ryan will cover market trends, market behaviors, as well as some observations on commodity types. Then I'll say a few words on pricing methodology, including the use of data in pricing. Ryan, over to you.
Thank you, Rich. After 25 years of a continuous soft market, at the end of 2018, we started to see a hardening of the ocean cargo market. It started in London, and then it made its way to North America very shortly thereafter. And there was a return to technical rating based on exposures rather than the soft market rating that had gone on over several years. If you look over the last number of years, there's been a nice improvement in the rates and in the results for ocean cargo. You can check the IUMI statistics for that over the last couple of years. There were certain commodities that were more affected than others, such as automobiles, since with their large losses due to port accumulation and the open lot storage claims, as well as some significant general average and claims due to the ro-ro vessels. Also pharmaceuticals and perishables. And what you had there, where you had some significant large losses in the market. And a lot of that has to do with the high value you can fit in a small space. For example, with a general cargo loss to a truck fire or a truck accident could be $200,000 or $300,000. With a with a full container load of pharmaceuticals in demand, that could be $30 million. And there's been some significant losses there. And then also retail stock throughputs, meaning the extension of the ocean cargo to not just cover stock, but to cover stock while in retail stores. And that provides a whole host of additional exposures with regard to CAT. And in North American market, it also provided a significant amount of losses during the 2020 riots, which hit the market, pretty hard. What we've been seeing over the last several months, even due to the improvement in terms and conditions as well as in rates, we started to see what we would call as maybe a deceleration in the amount of increase of the rates. So we're still seeing rate increases generally. However, the rate of that increase is starting to get less and smaller. There's actually a number of, there's some new capacity out of London that's here in the North American market. And as the rates have gotten better, it becomes more akin to some of additional capacity entering the market, which is normal. And we would see the market trends to a stabilization of the market where there's not such wide continued increase since we've got the 3 years of the harder market and a return to technical underwriting. Rich, do you want to take on your piece?
Sure. Thanks, Ryan. So there's an old joke that goes, how do you price cargo? Add up the losses and divide by 0.5. So while not particularly complimentary of the cargo underwriter, there was some truth to that statement. But pure loss rating is becoming less prominent, as Ryan has indicated, and the introduction of a more disciplined method is taking hold. So why is that? Well, first, there's a lot more volatility in a cargo insurer's portfolio than, say, 20 years ago. So it's not just about funding for attritional losses, but also funding for larger losses over a period of time. Many policies are stock throughputs that contain natural catastrophe and fire exposures at warehouses for significant limits. And as we heard earlier, vessel sizes have increased, exposing an insurer to potentially larger loss events than in the past. This means that pure loss rating may not properly identify the proper premium to be charged. I would say the trend is to incorporate as much objective data as possible in establishing a price. One obvious example is the utilization of catastrophe models to establish the natural catastrophe portion of the price to be charged. But over time, I think we need to go even further as an industry. For example, Captain Kinsey talked about container fires. Container vessel fires are on the rise, and one of the main culprits for this trend is misdeclared cargo. In the aftermath of the Maritime, Maersk asked if the National Cargo Bureau, which is a container inspection service, among other things, would conduct some inspections. And NCB looked at over 500 imported shipments. Of that study, 8% of the containers were misdeclared, and 2.5% of the inspections were misdeclared that the National Cargo Bureau considered a serious safety risk to the ship. So there's about 5.4 million containers shipped annually that contain declared dangerous goods. Applying that 2.5% to that figure indicated that 135,000 containers are shipped per year that are misdeclared and are a serious safety risk to shipping crew. So this is just one example of some data that is available, but over time, cargo insurers should seek to build in data such as this into their pricing models. Ulrich, I think I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Yep. Thank you, Rich. Yes. So which then really leads us to the last part of this webinar, even though we do have 25 minutes for it, which is the Q&A. And we touched upon many topics, some of which we covered in our report, and then also Rich and Ryan some more live market insight into the cargo and marine market. So you can really ask us about anything that was covered today, or any other questions that you have on your mind regarding the marine market. And just as a reminder, there is in the WebEx bottom right, there is a Q&A chat box. So you just type in the question there, and then the panelists, inclusive of me, will be able to see that. So we do have one question already posted here. Actually, they are just speaking, but one of the questions here was, how is IoT, so Internet of Things, helping the disruption in supply chain or even the AIS? So that's probably a question best answered by our ARC colleagues. Rahul or Andrew, do you have any thoughts on this? How is Internet of Things helping the disruption in supply chain or even AIS?
I can give it a shot. I think the IoT industry, which is an absolute booming industry today, has given us a lot of more visibility, and that includes AIS as well, on where the cargoes are, where the vessels are. More so where the vessels are than the cargo, because IoT penetration for cargo itself isn't as great as what we have for AIS. Because of AIS, now we can see probably each and every vessel on the ocean, where it is and where it's going, and even get some information on how long it's going to take to complete this voyage to its destination. But for IoT devices, for example, the devices that are installed in containers, the penetration itself is not so much. It is still restricted to high-value containers like pharmaceuticals or some of the other segments where there is a real need to understand or to know on a continuous basis the position of the container, maybe even the temperature, maybe the integrity of the container, the door seals, etc. I think how these things have helped, or how they can help in this disruption. I think from the AIS perspective, it's there's quite a few things that can be done. One of the key things that they are working on is looking at optimizing how the ports provide information to the vessels on arrival times and how that information is relayed to the ships. We see so many times that, and Andrew and myself have been at sea for many years, and have been hearing shouting on the other end saying, well, speed up because you need to reach the port. But once we reach the port, we are sitting there for 5-7 days or even 10 days at anchor, trying to just sit there and wait our turn to get in. Now, this is a prime example of inefficiencies that have been in the shipping industry for years now. Simple thing, how we can resolve this, if only the ports could coordinate their turnaround times, their waiting list to the agents or to the vessels. There is absolutely no need for vessels to be hurtling down the seaways and burning additional fuels, and by the way, providing a huge amount of emissions in that process into the atmosphere, whereas they could have simply gone on slow speed steaming and made its way to the vessels and make it a little more efficient and how we deal with this. Supply chain in general, otherwise, I think there's a lot more transparency on how where the containers are, where there's blockages, and those can be improved. IoT in itself, I think at the moment for this problem is a little limited in respect, but Andrew, I don't know if you have any other ideas on this.
Yes, I do, Rahul. Thank you. At present, the maritime industry is collecting massive amounts of data. At present, we are not fully utilizing this metadata. And for example, in the Arctic, it is going to be critical that we do a quicker turnaround on available data because we have to change how we plan our voyages. Traditionally, maritime, we've always looked at casualties and taken lessons learned. We can't afford to do that in the Arctic realm. We must build on success. We must use the metadata that is being captured in successful voyages and turn that around quickly and utilize it for follow-on voyages so that we're building on a model of success and towards success rather than a model that teaches away from failure. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and then maybe just one or two additional thoughts I would add to it, and then we'll move on. So I think the current disruptions that we're seeing in the supply chain, as Rahul outlined in his part of the presentation, COVID-driven and the Internet of Things technology probably wouldn't have helped much in avoiding that. But one of the use cases we have seen, and also we have tested with one of the providers of the Internet of Things technology, is that it really helps us understand certain causes of loss that happen in the supply chain to exactly depict where they happened, and then what could possibly be done to avoid them going forward. So it's really more of this, individual loss or frequency type of events where the IoT technology can provide some meaningful insight to improve risk control. And of course, then if these events are also a cause of a bigger disruption in the supply chain, there could be the correlation, but probably a bit limited to avoid what we're seeing at the moment. Okay, so with that said, there's a few other questions that came in. I'll just continue on here. Next one is, besides regulations, are there any practical steps being taken to limit opportunities for misdeclarations? Besides regulations, are there any practical steps being taken to limit opportunities for misdeclarations? So, Rich, you brought up the topic of misdeclarations. Maybe you have any thoughts right off the top of your head. Andrew, I see you nodding. Maybe you want to share some of your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, and I can start with that, Ulrich, just to give a little more background. I think one of the short answers is increasing inspections as one sort of enforcement procedure. And some background on the NCB study that I referenced. I skipped over a lot of detail in the interest of time, but Maersk came to the National Cargo Bureau and asked them if they would do 100 free inspections, just as a industry contribution to try to dig into this issue. And what NCB decided to do was actually offer 500 free inspections, not just focused on Maersk, but all container lines. And they got a pretty favorable response, which is how they got to 500. Since that time, and one of the reasons why they did that, obviously selfishly, was to try to increase their work and their income to do additional container inspections. So I think, and they have gotten some take up. So I think part of it's on the container line, part of it is random inspections, but one of the challenges that we have and what NCB did was they did it on imports. So it's really looking in the rear view mirror. Clearly where we need it to start is as the vessel sets sail. So that's one of the challenges in this whole thing. But Andrew, I know you've got some comments as well.
Actually, Rich, it piggybacks on yours because as part of NCB's ongoing efforts on this, they've partnered with Exis Technologies and are currently using an AI-based machine learning tool to look at cargo manifests and help to identify through machine learning misdeclared or undeclared hazardous cargoes.
Maybe just to add just one little thing, I don't think it's an opportunity. It is definitely an opportunity, but it is a bit of a self-regulation that the shippers around the world need to go, because as Rich was saying, if we are looking at containers or boxes arriving and doing inspections on them, we are looking at the rear view mirror. What we really need to do is to get somehow the message across to the shippers, which might be all over the world in some of these places where these boxes and containers are being stuffed. That the declarations are made accurately, the weights are declared accurately. And a few years ago, a cargo transportation unit, a CTU code was released, which was unfortunately till now a non-mandatory code, but it is an excellent piece of code which provides information on how to store cargoes, how to stuff the containers, how the declaration should be made. And in that code, it was clearly mentioned that it's the shippers who are clearly responsible for making the right kind of declarations of the weight and of the type of cargoes. I don't know how long it's going to take to actually make that code mandatory, if at all, or if ever. But I think from our side, whenever we have an opportunity, we try and raise awareness with our shippers to use those codes and to seek industry best practices.
Okay, thank you, Rahul. Moving on, there is a question here from one of the participants on COVID. So do you see many insured cargo claims due to the pandemic, COVID-19? Are there any figures available? So we typically don't share the Allianz loss figures specifically, but maybe Ryan, do you have a few comments to make on this? Do you see many insurance cargo claims due to the pandemic COVID-19?
No, we do not, and most of that is due to cargo. Most fundamentally, provides coverage for all risk of physical loss or damage from any external cause, and due to that's where the enhanced that's where the coverage for cargo is. COVID would not be covered, and there's always sometimes the potential that there might be an extra expense, but there's been very few, if any, claims with regard to that. But generally, no, because of what the cargo coverage provides, which is physical loss or damage from any external cause.
Yeah, exactly. Couldn't have said it any better, Ryan. So there you go. So the next question here is on cyber risk. What is your opinion and observation of cyber risk? Do you detect more cyber-related incidents compared to the past years and in other lines of business? It's probably a good question, well, for both our risk control engineers and also underwriters. Rahul, Rich?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
let me take the first take at this. Only yesterday, I think I was reading, yesterday or day before yesterday, I was reading a report for another cyber attack on one of the largest shipping companies in the world. And this follows, I think, a string of these cyber attacks and cyber hacks or ransomware attacks on shipping companies in the last year or so. So to answer the question, do we detect more cyber-related incidents? Definitely. We have seen quite a big rise on number of instances where hackers and some other criminal organizations have attacked shipping companies, especially ones the liner companies like the container vessels. And you might remember some of the big names. We had losses running up to hundreds of millions of dollars last year, which made the headlines. And there is these losses are absolutely on the increase. We have also seen, not just on shipping liners, in the sense that we've seen some instances where our cargo owners have also suffered because of these cyber attacks. One particular instance comes in mind where a couple of high-value containers were ended up in the wrong part of the world, and these were just-in-time deliveries just before the Christmas, and in the process, the goods absolutely had no more value left, and the goods deteriorated in the containers, and this was a direct result of a hack into the shipping company's databases, where the destination was changed by the hackers. Now, these sort of instances are a lot less, but the shipping companies, the attacks on the shipping companies from hackers, we've definitely seen an increase. To the question on other LOBs, I think there has been attacks on some of the other lines of businesses as well. Definitely, we've seen some of those. I won't have all the details there or much details on this one, but with regards to shipping, I think one of the mandatory requirements that came into the shipping industry from IMO was to have a detailed plans as part of the safety management system of the shipping companies, and what to do and how to protect themselves against such attacks. And this became mandatory from 1st of January. Most of the shipping companies have produced such documents. Some probably are still struggling with it, and this is definitely a step in the right direction. But the problem at the moment is quite extensive, as I see it, because in spite of all these measures, we are seeing a sharp rise in these attacks, cyber attacks on shipping companies.
Yeah, very good.
And
Thank you.
and then just from a coverage standpoint, will remain silent on cyber. However, approximately 2 years ago, the market and Allianz included, cyber. All cargo policies today have a cyber, the standard cyber exclusion you would see in the market, as the rest of the market has adopted the cyber exclusion clause as well.
Yeah, exactly. And then maybe just one additional comment regarding comparison to other laws, or maybe an observation which might be of interest as we are going into the treaty renewals for next year. It's also one of the items, of course, on my radar, and also what we're discussing internally within Allianz Global Corporate and Specialty. What we are seeing across the board is that the capacity is becoming a bit less easily available for cyber risk from a reinsurance perspective. So really having a strong, well thought through underwriting strategy and measurement of exposures is key to convince reinsurers to provide capacity. And obviously that's also testament to the fact that the exposure and the number of incidents have risen and are expected to continue to rise. Okay, so with that, well, we just touched upon this a little bit, the topic of autonomous shipping, and this is also what the next question here refers to. Can you share your thoughts on how will the autonomy or the autonomous operations be helpful in the maritime cargo industry? Maybe good to start off with the ARC colleagues on that one.
No, you're smiling. I think maybe you have something to say.
Okay.
Having spent decades out there, everything works great on a ship until it doesn't. And just from an aspect of having autonomous operations, we are not to the point where we can cross an ocean on a manned vessel with the primary machinery fully operating. Until we get to that point, we're not going to be successful in a fully autonomous environment. I do see an increase in automation. Now, there's a difference, of course, between the automated profile and the autonomous profile. And this goes back to what Rahul mentioned earlier on the impact on manpower in seafaring, and from a loss perspective, why it's important that we attract and retain a younger generation of seafarer who is both technically IT savvy and can also learn traditional maritime skills. If we don't marry that for the next generation, we will not be able to maintain and operate a successful shipping venture in a new automated environment at sea, because personally I feel we're a long ways from an autonomous operation. Rahul, if there's anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, slightly different view. What we are seeing today, we've already seen some couple of vessels, fully autonomous vessels, more trials than in operation as such, started to operate. Especially in Europe, we saw two of these vessels. The Yara Birkeland was probably the first one, which was a fully automated cargo vessel. The advent of these vessels are subject to a lot of debate. I mean, whether they will make the mainstream of shipping or not is a question only time will tell. The technology is already there. There's a lot of issues regarding the regulation, a lot of issues regarding liability, a lot of issues against who controls them, how does it work, how does the interaction between an autonomous vessel and a non-autonomous vessel work, who's going to be responsible for what sort of actions, collision avoidance. There is a huge list of such questions which needs to be answered before something like this can be even thought about putting in the mainstream. Purely on the idea basis, if you're looking at can this bring some sort of an efficiency in our industry where you have autonomous vessels, autonomous other transport means? Theoretically, yes. But as Andrew was saying, we are still talking about 49 total losses and 2,700 incidents at sea. How are we going to control vessels which do not have crew on board, which do not have any support on board, and how do we manage an incident or an incident on board such vessels? On the road transportation side, I'm sure you all have heard about Tesla's new autonomous cargo trucks. As and when they come, as and when they make into the mainstream, is I certainly have no ideas of that. But again, these ideas are great at the moment, but it is still and there's a lot of work needed to bring them into mainstream and actually deliver some sort of an efficiency for the industry.
Yeah, and there's a follow-up question here, and you kind of implied the answer, but it might be good just to briefly touch upon it. How do you see the unmanned trend at the light of the cyber risks? So Rahul, maybe along the lines of your thoughts, just addressing that specific question more directly. Mm-hmm.
I think in the morning session we talked about into a little bit of detail on this, as that so far there hasn't been an attack on board a vessel where there has been an actual major incident because of a cyber hack or a cyber attack on a ship, and because of that there has been a physical loss or damage. Maybe because of that, I think the industry still probably believes that this is something that will not happen, but the pace at which these attacks are happening and then cyber criminals are becoming sophisticated with every passing day, it's only a matter of time that something like this happens. Hopefully, it is a smaller one, manageable instance. But the issue is that if we are looking at fully autonomous vessels or fully autonomous transport units, whatever they might be called, the chances of managing an incident, as I just said, becomes tenfold a lot more difficult if there is nobody on board. I mean, in today's operations, we know if something goes wrong, we have backup A and we have backup B, and in the shipping industry and shipping operations are well known for having 1, 2, 3 backup plans in case things go wrong. How does that get addressed if you don't have any people on board, and worse so if the cyber attack happens and the control of such a vessel is taken over by people you don't want them to have such a vessel? So I think it's something which is going to have big implications, and this is something that we seriously need to consider before autonomous vessels are put into operation.
Okay, very good. And there's another question here from one of the participants on claims. We are getting different figures when it comes to the value of cargo damage in transit. There's some on pharma products by air, others in the tune of billions in food by the FAO. Could you give us an indication on how much cargo is damaged on all modes? Now, we don't have that data readily available other than what might be available via public sources, but I'm thinking it might be sensible to comment a bit on where we have seen an increased trend of claims specific to modes. And Ryan, you commented on that a little bit in your section by sector and also by mode of transit. Do you want to take this one, and maybe with the angle that I was?
Yeah, I don't have really like a set data, but we could tell, or talk about what we've seen. But we have seen, an uptick in claims to perishable cargoes, and that's because they're much more sensitive. You have the potential for almost any type of claim. So you could have temperature excursions where the refrigeration breaks down. You could have it's still subject to all the other potential claims, such as if it's on a truck accident. You had during COVID a shortage of aircraft for a while, so you had these perishable goods that were going by aircraft had to go by different methods. So some of them got into a reefer container and then wound up on the ocean, which takes a couple of additional weeks and is much more perilous. So as you've seen, maybe some more of the stabilization with some of the air capacity back into the market, we've seen some improvement. But also, if there was a mention of pharmaceuticals, it also comes down to the value of that cargo. And I had mentioned that earlier, that a container or a truck full of frozen crab or chilled crab is a lot different than a truck full of medicine, which could be $25 to $50 million in a truck, rather than $300,000 to $1 million in a truck. So we're still seeing all methods of potential rough handling and damage claims. We're seeing, truck accidents are still occurring, truck fires are still occurring in Europe. There are still claims on vessels. We're seeing less claims, but as the presentation indicated, we're seeing the mega ships, and with the mega ships, when an occurrence occurs, such as a 1 Apis or an Eindhoven or an Essen, where it hits heavy weather and a bunch of containers go overboard, it's a much larger event. So, so there's the benefits, but there's also then the potential for larger events, and we're seeing some of those larger events play out in the market.
Thank you, Ryan. And you finished right on time. So we are actually out of time for that webinar. There's also one question here. Maybe I just repeat this for the full audience, whether the presentations will be available for participants. And yes, both the slides and the recording will also be available on our website from tomorrow onwards. So if you're interested in looking at it again, you are free to do so. So with that, I do want to thank you all for joining us today and for submitting your questions and for showing so much interest. So thank you for that. If there's any follow-up questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. We're happy to help. Also, don't forget to access the copy of the Safety Shipping Review. It's also available on our website for download at any time. And just before you go, once you exit the WebEx, there will be a very quick poll where you have the chance to provide feedback, what went well, what we can improve upon. It would be great if you just take another minute to share this with us so we can make this webinar even better going forward. And with that, thanks again for joining, for taking the time, and we will close it here.